Hello Finxters and welcome to a new Pandas tutorial. Today we are looking at how to read and write JSON objects with Pandas. So in this tutorial we will see how to transform a JSON object into a Pandas data frame and the other way around. And we will use the Pandas functions readJSON and toJSON. Working with JSON objects in Pandas is a very essential skill because we often find data stored in the JSON format. So to start off, we will see what a JSON object is and how it looks like. The term JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation, and it is a way to store and transport all sorts of information in a very organized way. JSON makes the data very easy accessible and readable, and it is often used for sending information from server to a website. So it's often used in the terms of web development, but also in other use cases. Here's a typical JSON object that you can see. JSON, the data is often, it's always in pairs of attributes and values. So for example, name is the attribute, Luke is the value. And the values can have all sorts of data types, can be strings, integer, float values, Boolean values. But it can also be an array which contains more JSON objects. For example, the children attribute has an array as a value, and this array contains 2 more JSON objects. And these are the children of Luke in this case. So now we will see how to convert a JSON object into a Pandas data frame. Therefore, we will use this JSON object that you can see right here. JSON objects can have different formats, different structures, and therefore we need to read them in depending on what the structure is. And this one right here has the structure that we have the attributes columns, index, and data. And each attribute has an array. And inside this array, we get the values for each attribute. For example, the columns attribute has the values length and height. So the data frame that we want to get has length and height as the columns. And now we start the actual coding. First of all, we import Pandas. And now we create a data frame, we call it df1, and we use the readJSON function. And we apply the path of the JSON object, of the JSON file where it is stored. And here we can just copy the path and paste it in here. And the crucial part now is the orient parameter. And we apply it the value split because this is the format of the JSON object that we just saw. And now we output the data frame. And as you can see, the data frame, it's a typical Pandas data frame with 2 columns, length and height, and 2 indexes, or 2 rows, fish and dog, and some values, some integer values for example, the fish's length, and so on. But JSON objects can have different kinds of formats. This one, for example, is this format is called records, or this is the value that we will apply to the orient parameter. And as you can see, it has a different structure than the one we have seen before. We do not have the index names here, and the structure overall is a little bit different because it is stored in an array. And we read it in a bit differently. We create another data frame, df2. Again, we read in the JSON, or we use the readJSON function, and we again need to apply the path. Let me just copy it and paste it in. Again, we apply the orient parameter, and as I said, it's called records. And if we output that, you see that we get this data frame here, but compared to the other one, you see that the index labels are not like before, because the JSON format we have seen doesn't support that. But luckily, we have the rename function in Pandas, so we can easily rename index labels, and this is how we do it. df2 equals df2.rename. Inside here, we apply the index parameter to state that we want to rename the index labels. We could also apply the columns parameter, but we don't want to rename them, so it's just index. And we apply a dictionary, and inside this dictionary we state which indexes we want to rename. So index label of 0 we want to call fish, and index label 1 we want to call dog. And if we output that, we see that actually now the data frame looks like before. We have the new index labels, fish and dog, or the initial ones, and we successfully renamed it. Let's have a look at one more example, or one more JSON format. And as you can see, it's right here. This is like the index formats that we for each index, we apply the value for each row and so on. As you can see, fish, for example, for fish, the length is 3 and the height is 1. And if we read it incorrectly, we should get to the exact same data frame. So we call it df3. Again, we read in pd.readJSON. Again, we need to put in the path, and let me just copy it. Again, we apply the orient parameter. This time we call it index, as I said. And if we output that, you can see that we get exactly the same data frame as before. So we can have different kinds of formats in JSON, and we can, depending on how we read it in, we get the same data frame, which is very nice. And now we will see how to convert the data frame into a JSON object. So it's the other way around. Basically, we use df3 for this purpose. And we have to do the following. First, we have to import the JSON library, which is used for decoding and encoding JSON objects. Then we do JSON string, that's a new variable. And we say df3.toJSON, that's the function we are using here. And again, we apply the parameter split to get this structure that we've seen in the first place. And the toJSON function turns a data frame into a JSON string. And we also have to do this. We have to use the JSON loads function, which passes the JSON string and converts it into a Python dictionary. And inside here we pass in JSON string. And finally we print the outputs. We need to put a print statement here to get a nice structure, to have it in a good structured way. So like this. And the dumps function converts the dictionary into a JSON object, and we pass in the indents parameter to specify the indentation of the JSON object. And if we output that, you see that we get a JSON object like we've seen one before. Yeah, it's in the split structure or the split format as we've seen in the first place. And as you might guess, we can also do it in other structures. Let me just copy that, pass it in here. And this time we do, instead of split format, we do values. And this gets only the values of the data frame that we've seen in the first place. So no column labels, no index labels, and so on. We could also, instead of split, say columns. And this structures the JSON object by the column names. Yeah, so now we've seen a few ways to convert data frames into JSON object. We can also build a whole table schema. And the only difference is that for the orient parameter we choose table. And as you can see, the output is way larger because we get a lot more information here. Basically, this JSON object is divided into two parts: the schema and the data section. The data section contains the same data as we've seen before, and the schema section allocates the data types of the index and the columns, and it provides us with a primary key, which is not very important here, but it also provides us with the Pandas version. It seems to be hard-coded to 0.20.0. If we want to get our actual Pandas version, we can do pd.__version__. So it's actually 1.3.4, but you know, in this example before, the Pandas version seems to be hard-coded, but this is a way to get the actual Pandas version. Now we can also write a JSON object to a own JSON file. Therefore, we do basically the same as before. Let's choose the columns structure, but we do not print it, but we assign it to a variable. Let's call it data, and we use the with statement, which makes working with files very easy. And we say with open, and we call this new file new data, and we put in the file extension .json, because that's very important to say the program, okay, we want to create a JSON file here. And we use W to say, this stands for writing a new file, as file.write. And inside here we put in the data to say that we want to use the data variable that contains the actual JSON object. And you see that we do not get an output, but we get a new JSON file, which is stored in the working directory. And as you can see, we now have successfully created a new JSON file, which is structured like this, with length and heights columns. So it's structured by a column, because inside the orient parameter we put in columns, the column string. So yeah, to put it in a nutshell, working with JSON objects in Pandas is very useful, since the data is often stored in the JSON format. We have seen how to transform JSON objects into Pandas data frames and how to turn data frames into JSON objects. And we've seen how to write newly created JSON objects to an own JSON file. yeah, that was the tutorial. I hope you liked it, and I see you in the next one. Goodbye.